If you believe you already understand where loyalty begins and where it breaks inside a fractured Hollywood family, pause for a moment, because what you are about to hear will push you to question everything you thought you knew about emotional ties, public success, and the invisible wounds that define a teenager's world. Before we take one more step into this unfolding story, leave a comment right now telling me what you think shapes forgiveness more deeply: shared pain or shared prosperity. Do you believe a child gravitates toward the parent who climbs or the parent who endures? Your voice matters here, and it shapes the direction of the entire conversation. And do not move, because every detail that follows is part of a larger emotional puzzle. I will not reveal everything at once, and I will not anticipate what is coming. The only way to understand the story is to stay through its final question, the one that lingers long after the words end. Picture a stage divided by an invisible line. On one side, there is light, movement, a sense of forward momentum. On the other, there is heaviness, a kind of emotional gravity pulling everything downward. Standing in the middle is a boy on the threshold of adulthood, Jolie-Pitt, who finds himself caught between two emotional landscapes that could not be more different. This is not the public story you see splashed across magazine covers. This is not the narrative simplified by commentators who believe they can sum up a family's pain with a headline. This is the deeper world, the internal world, the world where loyalty is not something spoken but something felt, where betrayal is not declared but quietly absorbed, and where wounds do not bleed outward but inward. On the brighter side of that divide stands Brad Pitt, stepping into a new chapter that the world sees as glowing, dynamic, renewed. He moves through airports, through glamorous events, through intimate dinners with a new partner, through spacious homes and luxurious escapes. His demeanor suggests lightness, as if a weight has been lifted from his life, as if he has found the sweet spot between recovery and reinvention. To the outside world, this transformation looks like liberation. It looks like the arc of a man who has survived turmoil and is finally reclaiming the narrative of his own life. But what the world sees is never the whole story. What the world sees is a reflection, not the truth. The truth lies in how this transformation is perceived by the son watching from a distance, a son who lives in a very different emotional climate. Because on the other side of that invisible divide is Angelina Jolie, grappling with an entirely different reality. Her world has been shaped by years of legal conflict, by financial strain described by her own legal team as draining, by stress that creeps into every corner of daily life. She is portrayed not as a glamorous star, but as a mother in survival mode, balancing her public identity with the private responsibility of holding her family together. Her exhaustion is not symbolic, it is lived. It shows in the hours spent with lawyers, in the decisions she must make alone, in the weight of being the emotional anchor for children who have experienced a rupture far deeper than any outsider can comprehend. And while the world sees Brad's bright new era, Knox sees his mother carrying the emotional cost of everything that has unfolded. That contrast becomes the lens through which Knox experiences both parents. Adolescence is a period when young people sharpen their perceptions, recognize inconsistencies, and begin to form emotional conclusions that shape them for years. And Knox, standing between a parent living in renewal and a parent living in exhaustion, begins to absorb the imbalance. He sees a mother who is not just navigating stress, but embodying it. He sees her tired, stretched thin, working through battles that seem endless. He feels the heaviness in the atmosphere of the home she maintains. And then he looks outward and sees his father stepping into something lighter, something freer. The emotional disconnect is unmistakable. This is the beginning of the divide that outsiders misunderstand. They assume distance is imposed externally, perhaps instructed or manipulated. But emotional distance rarely works that way. It forms internally. It forms when a teenager feels unsheltered, when he feels that one parent's emotional state mirrors his own struggle, while the other parent appears to exist in a different emotional universe. For Knox, the emotional universe he is attuned to is not the one filled with travel, romance, and prestige. It is the one filled with tension, fatigue, and the effort to hold everything together. That universe shapes his sense of safety. Brad, in his own way, may believe he is healing, recovering, forging ahead, reclaiming control of his life. But for a teenager like Knox, who sees the lingering impact on his household, Brad's renewed life may feel like a departure, an escape, or even a dismissal of the family's ongoing pain. To Knox, each moment of public joy, each glamorous sighting, each romantic detail picked up by the media may feel like a reminder that the emotional battle has not been shared equally. Adolescents often perceive imbalance not through evidence, but through emotional context. And the emotional context of Knox's life right now is shaped by what he sees inside the home he shares with his mother, not by the world outside. Reports suggest his contact with his father has been limited in recent years. Limited contact is not silence, but it is distance. And distance is rarely born from a single action. It forms slowly, through the accumulation of emotional contrasts. It forms when a child observes who is present in the struggle and who seems to exist beyond it. It forms when one parent's world feels familiar and the other's world feels foreign. Even if there is no explicit animosity, silent distance can grow until it becomes its own boundary. His siblings' choices have not gone unnoticed either. In families with multiple children, emotional patterns echo through the group. When other siblings pull away, when they change their names or restrict communication, when they search for identities separate from their father, Knox witnesses those choices and absorbs their implications. It reinforces the idea that the emotional truth of the family lies with the parent who remains within the struggle, not the one who appears to have moved beyond it. This is not to say that Brad does not feel or does not care. It is to say that perception shapes emotional reality, and perception, for Knox, is more powerful than any public statement. Knox does not need to read legal transcripts to sense who carries the emotional weight. He sees it every day in the posture of his mother, in the atmosphere of the home, in the subtle signs of fatigue that come from prolonged conflict. He sees someone fighting not for luxury, not for image, but for stability. To a teenager searching for emotional grounding, that stability matters more than anything else. It becomes the compass by which loyalty is directed. And loyalty, at this age, is not a conscious decision. It is instinctual. It is felt. It is rooted not in logic, but in the sensation of being understood. For Knox, understanding comes from the parent whose emotional reality aligns with his own environment. It comes from one who has remained inside the storm instead of stepping outside of it. And that alignment becomes the foundation for his sense of home. This sense of home does not mean comfort. It means emotional consistency. He may feel tension, sadness, or instability, but he feels it with the parent who shares the struggle, not with the parent who appears to have transcended it. This is what deepens the emotional divide. It is not anger. It is not rebellion. It is the longing for shared experience. And now the question becomes more complicated. What does success represent to a child who associates it not with security, but with separation? Brad's success, wealth, and flourishing lifestyle do not exist in Knox's mind as achievements. They exist as symbols. Symbols of a life rebuilt elsewhere. Symbols of a parent stepping into brightness, while the rest of the family remains in the shadows. Even if that perception is incomplete, it is emotionally real. And emotional reality is what shapes the bond between parent and child. For Knox, the wealth his father possesses does not represent possibility. It represents distance. It represents a life that continued to expand while his mother's world contracted under pressure. And once wealth becomes symbolic, it cannot easily return to being neutral. It becomes part of the emotional narrative, a narrative that shapes every interaction, every silence, every moment of hesitation. This is the emotional climate at the core of the relationship. A son trying to reconcile the contrast between the parent who flourishes and the parent who endures. And that reconciliation may be impossible until something shifts, until the imbalance is addressed, until emotional wounds are acknowledged rather than just observed. The deeper you move into Knox's emotional landscape, the clearer it becomes that what he is navigating is not a simple division between two parents, but a profound internal conflict shaped by what he sees, what he feels, and what he silently carries. A teenager does not articulate his pain in essays or formal declarations. He reveals it in distance, in silence, in the subtle shifts of proximity that adults often overlook. And the silence surrounding Knox's bond with his father is not an empty void. It is full of meaning, full of tension, full of emotional static that grows louder as the contrast between his parents becomes more visible. To understand this silence, you must step into the emotional gap between wealth and pain. Wealth moves freely. Pain stays still. Wealth expands. Pain contracts. Wealth travels rooms filled with laughter. Pain sits in quiet spaces heavy with fatigue. Knox watches these differences every day. And while the world interprets Brad's renewed life as a sign of progress, Knox may interpret it as a sign of distance. He may see it not as triumph, but as detachment, not as healing, but as separation from the emotional truth he experiences in his own home. The strongest emotional bonds form in shared struggle. That is the environment Knox finds himself in with Angelina. Her strength, though often perceived as resilience, may also be felt by him as fragility, and fragility invites protection. He witnesses her carrying the burden of legal complications, emotional strain, and the responsibility of shielding her children from the hardest truths. When a child sees a parent fighting alone, their loyalty is not negotiated. It becomes instinctive. It becomes an emotional calling. Knox sees his mother grappling with complexities he cannot fully comprehend, yet he feels the impact of every one of them. He sees the exhaustion that follows her from room to room. He senses the weight that does not lift. He witnesses the vulnerability she works to hide. And these observations shape not only his loyalty but his identity. He is a teenager caught in the echo chamber of a divided family. The choices of his siblings reverberate around him. When brothers or sisters create distance from their father, when they detach from his name or his presence, it reinforces the narrative that the emotional center of the family lies with their mother. Adolescents look for patterns, for signs that their instinct is aligned with the instincts of those closest to them. Knox sees not just his own discomfort, but the collective discomfort of his siblings. Each decision they make becomes another piece in the framework of his own emotional interpretation. When a family moves together in silence, that silence becomes a truth of its own. But the most powerful influence shaping his emotional distance is the contradiction between what he lives and what he sees in the world around him. The world watches Brad flourish. They say he is thriving, reinventing himself, entering a new era of stability and romance. But Knox does not feel that stability. He does not live inside that renewed era. Instead, he watches from the outside as his father steps further into a life that seems untouched by the suffocating weight his mother carries. This is the kind of emotional contrast that embeds itself into a young person's psyche. It shapes his beliefs about who shows up, who stays, who carries the pain, and who leaves it behind. He may never say it aloud, but Knox might feel that his father's new life is built on a platform that excludes the suffering of their household. And to a teenager, exclusion feels like betrayal. The betrayal is not in the actions themselves, but in the timing, in the symbolism, in the sense that the family's hardest years did not stop Brad's ascent. And from Knox's vantage point, the emotional message may be this: one parent remained inside the storm, and the other learned how to walk above it. Yet, even with this emotional weight pressing down on him, Knox exists in a liminal space. He is not a child anymore, but he is not yet an adult. He understands complexity, but not fully. He sees truths, but through the lens of youth. He feels things intensely, but he does not yet have the tools to express them. This is why his silence becomes significant. Silence becomes his language. Silence becomes his shield. Silence becomes his emotional stance. In families shaken by conflict, silence often speaks louder than confrontation. Imagine being in his place. Each day begins with a mother fighting battles that do not end. Each day ends with the feeling that the emotional center of the family must be held together by the ones who remain inside the struggle. And between those moments, Knox must navigate the sense that the world expects him to understand, to forgive, to reconnect, even as the emotional cost of doing so grows heavier. He may feel protective of his mother in ways he cannot articulate. A teenager who sees a parent exhausted does not simply stand by. He internalizes that exhaustion. He transforms it into vigilance. He watches for signs of strain. He becomes attuned to emotional shifts. And that vigilance becomes a form of loyalty. A loyalty rooted in empathy, in shared pain, in the unspoken understanding that one parent bears more than the other. This loyalty shapes the distance. It makes him hesitant to step into a world that appears brighter, easier, and more glamorous than the one he knows. He may feel that doing so would be a betrayal of the parent who remains by his side. He may believe that seeking connection with his father is incompatible with the emotional reality he shares with his mother. This is how teenagers form emotional alliances, not out of conscious choice, but out of instinctive alignment with the parent whose world reflects their own. At the same time, he is also wrestling with the powerful influence of perception. Perception becomes truth for adolescents. They interpret glimpses of reality as complete narratives. They fill in the blanks with emotion. And when they see one parent uplifted by a new life, and the other weighed down by the remnants of the old one, perception becomes a dividing wall. Knox may not know the nuances of Brad's internal world, but he knows the impact of the external one. And that external world is loud. It headlines. It shines. It celebrates. Meanwhile, the internal world he inhabits is quiet, heavy, and unrelenting. He is torn between the parent who appears to have moved on and the parent still living the consequences of the past. He is torn between public happiness and private pain. He is torn between success and struggle. This tension becomes the framework of his emotional development, and within that framework, forgiveness becomes a distant concept. Before a teenager forgives, he must feel understood. He must feel seen. He must feel that the parent seeking forgiveness understands his pain. And Knox, observing from the imbalance between his parents' lives, may not believe that his father understands the emotional reality he is living. Not because Brad does not care, but because the contrast between their experiences is so drastic that empathy becomes difficult to perceive. And for a teenager, perceived empathy is everything. This is where the emotional distance grows into something deeper, something that may take years to unwind, something that cannot be fixed by money, gifts, apologies, or gestures, something that requires a fundamental shift in the emotional landscape, a recognition from the parent who stepped into a new life of the emotional consequences left behind. Yet even with all this, Knox is not fixed in place. He is still forming. He is still evolving. His emotional world is malleable, but only if the imbalance is addressed. Only if the parent he feels distanced from acknowledges the symbolic wound created by the contrast between their lives. Only if the emotional burden he sees his mother carrying is recognized rather than ignored. This is the silent truth of his adolescence. He is not choosing distance. He is choosing survival. He is choosing alignment with the emotional world that makes sense to him. He is choosing the parent who reflects the emotional climate he lives in. And until that climate changes, his silence will remain. To understand the full gravity of Knox's emotional silence, you must follow the thread deeper into the psychological maze, where loyalty is formed, shaped, and sometimes broken by the weight of conflicting realities. Adolescence is a time when identity is fragile but perceptive, vulnerable yet fiercely intuitive. Knox has lived long enough to sense when something is unbalanced, when the emotional terrain beneath him shifts unpredictably, when the structure of the family no longer supports him in the way it once did. And once a teenager begins to sense instability, he seeks steady ground not in logic, not in words, but in emotional resonance. His mother's struggle resonates. His father's success does not. This resonance becomes the emotional blueprint that shapes his internal compass. He associates safety not with comfort, but with shared pain. He associates trust not with promises, but with presence. He associates loyalty not with obligation, but with the alignment of emotional reality. His mother embodies all three. She is present in the struggle, present in the exhaustion, present in the slow, heavy rhythm of a household shaped by legal battles, financial strain, and emotional tension. Her presence is not glamorous. It is not effortless. It is not adorned with romance or rebirth. It is rooted in effort, in sacrifice, in the unglamorous act of enduring. And for a child who lives that suffering, endurance becomes the language of love. Brad's world, on the other hand, appears detached from this emotional landscape. Whether or not he feels anything privately is irrelevant to how Knox perceives it. Perception is everything. And what he perceives is a man stepping into new love, new experiences, new light. A man whose world has expanded while his mother's world has contracted. A man whose trajectory seems upward while the family's emotional foundation remains fractured. Knox is young, but he is not blind to these contrasts. And in the emotional economy of a teenager's mind, contrast is often interpreted as abandonment. This is not to say that Knox believes his father has intentionally abandoned anyone. Teenagers do not parse emotional nuance with adult sophistication. They interpret emotionally, instinctively, and often symbolically. When they see someone rise while another person struggles, they feel the rise as a departure and the struggle as a shared experience. And the one who shares the experience becomes the center of emotional loyalty. This loyalty manifests in silence. Silence becomes distance. Distance becomes boundary. And that boundary becomes the new shape of the relationship. For Knox, this boundary is not a wall built of anger, but a wall built of self-protection. If he were to move closer to his father's world, he might feel that he risks betraying the parent who remains grounded in the emotional truth he lives each day. He might feel that stepping into one emotional environment requires abandoning the other. And a teenager who feels responsible for the well-being of a struggling parent does not abandon. He aligns. This alignment is reinforced every time Knox sees the difference between how the world speaks about his father's new life and how he experiences the emotional reality of his own. Public narratives celebrate Brad's return to brightness. They admire his ability to reinvent himself. They portray him as a man who overcame challenges and emerged stronger. Meanwhile, the private narrative that Knox witnesses tells a different story. It tells of a mother battling exhaustion, so profound it becomes part of the atmosphere of the home. It tells of a family navigating tension, uncertainty, and emotional fatigue. It tells of a world where the consequences of conflict did not dissipate, but settled into the corners of every day. Children sense these consequences even when no one names them. They feel them when a parent sighs deeper than usual. They feel them when the mood of the home is heavy. They feel them when a routine is disrupted. They feel them when a parent's eyes tell a story their words refuse to say. Knox feels all of this. He absorbs it. He remembers it. And it becomes the emotional map by which he navigates the expanding distance between him and his father. He sees that his father's path has led him somewhere else, somewhere bright, but disconnected from the trenches the rest of the family remains in. And when a teenager feels that someone important has stepped out of the trench, he may interpret it as abandonment, even if that interpretation is not wholly accurate. Perception becomes memory. Memory becomes belief. Belief becomes emotional reality. And emotional reality becomes the truth that shapes a bond. Yet there is an even deeper layer, the question of betrayal. Teenagers experience betrayal not as a factual event, but as an emotional wound. And a wound forms whenever a young person feels that their experience has not been validated, acknowledged, or shared. Knox's relationship with his father is filtered through this lens. He may feel that his father's flourishing represents a failure to stand in the emotional fire with the family. He may feel that his father's brightness contrasts too sharply with the darkness he experiences at home. He may feel that his father continues forward while the rest of them remain suspended in the aftermath of conflict. He may feel, in the simplest terms, that the pain of the family did not matter enough to stop the momentum of his father's new life. And once a teenager feels that, trust becomes fragile. Even small gestures of reconnection feel heavy, complicated, emotional. This is the heart of the conflict. The emotional distance is not built on hatred, blame, or imposed restrictions. It is built on the feeling that one parent stayed inside the struggle while the other stepped outside of it. The inner world of a teenager does not draw fine distinctions. It draws emotional ones. And the emotional line between safety and distance has been drawn with clarity in Knox's mind. But what does he want? What does he truly crave beneath the layers of silence and emotional protection? Teenagers want understanding. They want acknowledgement. They want validation of their internal world. Knox wants his father to see the weight he has seen, to feel the heaviness he has lived, to recognize the emotional climate that shaped him. He wants a connection that does not gloss over the pain but addresses it directly. He wants a father who understands that his thriving was not neutral, that it carried meaning, that it created distance, that it shaped the emotional loyalty of a son who needed something else entirely. And this brings us to the heart of the story, the question of repair. Can a bond like this be rebuilt? Can a parent bridge the distance created not by a single choice, but by years of emotional contrast? Can success ever mend a fracture created during suffering? The answer is complicated. A bond can only begin to heal when the parent who flourished recognizes the symbolic impact of that flourishing. When he understands that emotional wounds form not because of what he built, but because of what his child witnessed during the building. When he acknowledges that the imbalance shaped not only the life of the family, but the heart of the child who stood in the middle of it. Rebuilding trust requires presence. Not physical presence, but emotional presence. A willingness to stand inside the emotional world of the child and say, "I see what you saw. I understand why it hurt. I know my new life created distance, and I am here to bridge it." Without that acknowledgement, the silence will continue. With it, there is a possibility, not a guarantee, but a possibility of reconnection. But until that moment comes, Knox remains exactly where he feels safest, aligned with the parent who stayed inside the struggle, aligned with the emotional gravity of the home, aligned with the truth he lived, rather than the image the world applauds. Now that you've reached the end of this deep dive, tell me in the comments what you believe truly separates Knox from his father. Is it the wealth, the emotional distance, the symbolic betrayal, or something deeper hidden in the silence between them? Your take matters. If you want the next investigation into the unseen emotional fractures behind Hollywood's most complicated families, say so. Stay curious, stay engaged, and remember that in stories like this, the truth is never where the spotlight shines. It's where the shadows fall.